Jasmine Crockett faced off against James Woods in the most brutal political showdown of the decade. A fierce clash over freedom of speech, moral decay, and the meaning of truth itself. Within minutes, James Woods hurled desperate accusations, trying to tear her down. But Jasmine never even raised her voice. One sentence, one collapse, an entire nation left stunned in silence. What happens when James Woods screams into the void, and the truth refuses to move? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The studio was a frozen battlefield dressed in light. Spotlights blazed down like merciless suns, bleaching every shadow from the room, making every flaw, every tremble, every flicker of doubt stark against the brutal white set. The audience sat behind a velvet rope barrier, a living wall of faces tight with anticipation, cell phones lowered, breaths half-held. In the center of it all stood two figures, separated by no more than a dozen feet, and yet by entire universes. James Woods, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, wore a dark, perfectly cut suit that gleamed under the lights, the image of defiance forged into flesh. He was announced with a voice dripping gravity. Tonight, joining us, the man standing against the growing tide of censorship, James Woods. The crowd split into a rumble. Cheers, boos, the unmistakable crackle of a coming storm. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett, poised in a simple yet unbreakable black suit, stood silent, the embodiment of tempered steel. She was introduced not with softness, but with a punch. And standing for those who refuse to bow to lies and injustice, Representative Jasmine Crockett. No handshake, no smile, just the deadly space between them, humming with the promise of war. The moderator barely mattered. This was never going to be a calm discussion. It was a collision course set by history itself. James Woods leaned forward first, his body language as sharp as broken glass, a smirk twitching at the edge of his mouth, his eyes cold and predator-like, scanned Jasmine as if measuring the weight of his prey. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her stance was loose but coiled, like a fighter waiting for the first punch to come, not fearing it, but daring it. The moderator rattled off the night's theme, freedom of speech and the battle for America's soul. But it was just background noise now, like the ticking of a bomb too late to stop. Woods cracked his knuckles under the table, loud enough for the microphones to pick up, drawing a ripple of laughter from his supporters. Jasmine's response was quieter, far deadlier, a slow, knowing tilt of the head, as if she'd already seen how this would end. The lights had barely dimmed from the countdown when James Woods struck first, his voice slicing the tense air with practiced cruelty. He leaned forward into the microphone, his face a rigid mask of anger, and began with a venomous certainty that brooked no hesitation. The so-called racial justice movement, he said, each syllable sharp as broken glass, has done more to tear this nation apart than any foreign enemy could have ever dreamed. A murmur rippled through the audience, confusion, outrage, approval, a living current of raw emotion stirred by the force of his words. Woods saw it and pressed harder, hammering each word like nails into the stage. We used to be a country that believed in merit, in effort, in rising above. Now we are told to kneel, to apologize, to accept that history is a weapon aimed at our children's heads. His voice deepened, riding a wave of his own fury. Movements that once spoke of equality now demand vengeance. They don't want a seat at the table. They want the table, the house, the land itself. His finger, rigid and accusatory, jabbed the air in Jasmine's direction, turning her into a living symbol of everything he decried. Cheers erupted from one side of the studio, a flash of raw tribal loyalty, but many faces stayed rigid, unsure, unsettled by how easily anger could be dressed up as patriotism. Jasmine Crockett stood motionless, letting the storm crash against her, her silence louder than any rebuttal. She knew this wasn't just an attack against her or her politics. It was an attack against every person who had ever been told they were dangerous simply for daring to exist. The lights burned hotter, the air grew heavier, and somewhere beneath Woods' roar, the first small cracks of fear began to form in the hearts of those who thought injustice could be shouted out of existence. But James Woods wasn't finished. Emboldened by the stir he caused, He leaned in again, determined to strike where it would leave the deepest scar. James turned sharply toward Jasmine, and this time there was no attempt at subtlety. His finger jabbed the air between them, his voice gaining the hard edge of accusation, sharpened by years of resentment. "You," he growled, his tone loaded with contempt, "stand as a monument to everything that's gone wrong in this country, the idol of identity politics." His words hit the room like gunfire, scattering shock and rage in uneven bursts across the crowd. Some audience members erupted into wild applause, rising to their feet as if summoned by a battle cry, while others stayed rooted in their chairs, faces blank, caught between discomfort and disbelief. Woods pressed on, voice rising, hands slicing the air. "You don't fight for justice. You fight for endless division, for keeping old wounds festering, open and bleeding, so you can trade them for power and pity." His accusations grew hotter, more venomous, fueled by a kind of desperate fury that mistook cruelty for strength. "People like you," he sneered, "don't want equality. You want permanent grievance. You want America to apologize forever, to kneel forever." The spotlight burned harder on Jasmine now, isolating her, magnifying her silence as the room roiled around her. But she stood still, absorbing every word without retreat, her presence a quiet but defiant refusal to be reduced to his caricature. She knew this performance by heart, had seen it played out in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in streets where protest signs were met with riot shields. In that moment, James Woods wasn't just attacking her ideas. He was trying to erase her existence from the national story, to paint her demand for dignity as a threat to the nation itself. Yet Jasmine knew true unity was never built on silence, never demanded forgetting, never required the victims to make themselves small for the comfort of the powerful. And as James's words faded into the electric hum of anger and uncertainty, she felt not defeat, but the gathering storm of something far more dangerous to men like him. The patience to wait for truth to strike back. For a moment it seemed the fury of James Woods might drown everything. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. Instead, she moved with the precision of a blade slipping through armor, her voice cutting colder and sharper than any shout. Jasmine leaned forward just slightly, her eyes locking onto Woods with a calm that burned hotter than anger. Her voice was low, deliberate, every word sharpened to pierce. "You talk about the soul of this country," she said, each syllable carrying the weight of generations. "You preach about virtue and decay. But tell me, Mr. Woods, have you ever truly looked into the mirror of your own past?" The words fell into the studio like heavy stones dropped into shallow water, breaking the surface, sending ripples through even the loudest partisans. For a heartbeat, the room seemed suspended in a strange gravity, as if everyone, even Woods himself, had forgotten how to breathe. Jasmine didn't blink, didn't falter. "You dare to lecture others on dignity," she continued, voice rising just enough to carve through the stunned silence. "When you have built your career on contempt, when you have wielded cruelty as your instrument, and arrogance as your shield." She didn't need to shout. Her control was its own weapon, colder and more devastating than rage. Across from her, James Woods shifted in his seat, the first crack in his armor glinting under the unforgiving lights. And in that instant, it was no longer just a debate. It was an interrogation, and James Woods had nowhere left to hide. Jasmine saw the crack widen, and with the calm cruelty of a surgeon who knows precisely where to cut, she pressed forward. Not to wound for spectacle, but to expose a rot too long left hidden. Jasmine straightened her back, her voice dropping into a lower, more measured register that carried across the studio like the cold certainty of a final verdict. "Amber Tamblyn was 16, she began, her words slow and deliberate, each one spaced like hammer strikes on a war drum. 16 years old, a child by every legal, moral, and human standard. She let that number hang in the air, heavy and undeniable, before driving the blade deeper. "And yet you, Mr. Woods, a man old enough to know better, powerful enough to know the difference, invited her to Las Vegas, smiling as if her age was not a warning, but a temptation." A visible ripple tore through the audience. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others froze entirely, their faces caught between disbelief and slow, growing horror. Jasmine didn't let up. Her voice remained calm, almost surgical, giving no quarter to the man across from her. And when she reminded you that she was underage, you didn't recoil. You didn't apologize. You said, even better. She paused, letting the words twist like a knife between them. The silence afterward heavier than any shout could have been. The camera operator instinctively pushed the lens closer, zooming tight on James Wood's face, now glistening with the first real beads of sweat, his jaw clenching and unclenching, as if trying to chew through the trap he had set for himself years ago. Jasmine stood utterly still, embodying not just herself, but every girl who had ever been reduced to an opportunity rather than a human being. In the searing heat of the lights, the truth was inescapable. Not wrapped in arguments, not clouded by noise. Raw, brutal, and laid bare for all to see. James Woods tried to hold on to his smirk, but it wilted at the edges, revealing the fragile scaffolding of a man who had built his outrage on sand. And as the seconds dragged into eternity, it became clear. There were no clever words that could unmake what had just been named. The battlefield had shifted, and for once, it was not the loudest voice that commanded it, but the one that dared to speak the simplest, hardest truth. But even as the truth hung heavy in the air, James Woods refused to yield. Pride, or desperation, forced him to reach for the one weapon he had left, denial wrapped in contempt. James Woods let out a sharp, humorless laugh, a brittle sound that cracked against the silence like a whip. He leaned back in his chair with exaggerated ease, though the tension in his jaw betrayed him, and waved a dismissive hand toward Jasmine. "A lovely little script," he sneered, his voice oozing condescension, "crafted by the finest minds of the progressive smear machine." The words dripped with derision, but they landed awkwardly, glancing off the raw gravity Jasmine had already carved into the room. "Everyone knows," Woods continued, forcing a grin that looked more like a grimace, "these so-called accusations are nothing but political theater. Desperate lies from desperate people who can't win with the truth." Some in the audience clapped, a sharp, scattered noise more reflex than conviction, while others sat stone-faced, the seed of doubt already growing where certainty once lived. The cameras stayed close on Woods' face, capturing every forced smirk, every twitch of nerves just beneath the surface. Jasmine said nothing yet. She didn't need to. The truth she had dropped into the room was doing its work in silence, heavier than all of Woods' bluster. And somewhere deep inside the theater of his defiance, James Woods seemed to sense it too. That denial, no matter how loud, could not erase what had already been seen. Feeling the ground shift beneath him, Woods lashed out harder, trying to claw back control with the only weapons he had left. Anger and accusation sharpened into blind, reckless fury. James Woods leaned forward, abandoning any pretense of composure, his voice hard and slicing. "This is what you do," he snapped, jabbing a trembling finger in Jasmine's direction, his words speeding up as desperation overtook him. "You and your movement. You turn lies into swords, you turn pity into power, and you use it to destroy anyone who doesn't bow to your narrative." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, but he pushed through, louder, meaner. "You weaponize guilt, you rewrite history, and you call it progress when it's nothing but the same old hunger for control, just dressed in new clothes." The audience stirred uneasily now, the earlier energy fading into a sticky discomfort, as if even those who had cheered him were beginning to taste the bitterness spilling from his mouth. "You don't want equality," Woods continued, spitting the word like it was poison. "You want obedience. You want everyone who disagrees with you labeled a bigot, crushed, erased." His face reddened under the studio lights, veins standing out against his temples, as if the force of his own outrage was tearing him apart from the inside. Jasmine said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence exposed his spiral more ruthlessly than any shouted rebuttal ever could. Around them, the air thickened, as if the room itself was recoiling, the cameras catching every twitch, every ragged breath, every inch of a man unraveling before millions of watching eyes. Jasmine let the silence stretch, let the weight of history settle thick over the room before lifting her voice, not to accuse but to reveal what so many were taught to suffer quietly. Jasmine unfolded the paper slowly, the sound sharp in the suffocating quiet, like the opening of a courtroom file before the verdict is read. She didn't rush, didn't grandstand. The truth didn't need theatrics. It needed space to breathe. Her voice came low and measured, each word deliberate, each sentence delivered like setting down stones, too heavy to lift again. Amber Tamblyn was 16 years old, she began, her tone neither cold nor angry, but carrying a solemnity that made the air itself seem heavier. She wrote of a night that stayed with her, not because it made her feel powerful, but because it made her feel small, seen not as a person, but as an opportunity. Jasmine's eyes stayed locked on Woods, refusing him the escape of looking away. I was just 16, she said, still thinking every adult in the room wanted to protect me, not mark me, still naive enough to believe that smiles were safe. The crowd had grown utterly still, as if the air itself refused to move. Jasmine pressed on, her voice slicing deeper, unwavering. When he invited me to Las Vegas, she wrote, I laughed. I thought he was joking. I thought adults didn't really mean things like that to girls like me. I reminded him of my age, 16, barely out of childhood. Jasmine's fingers tightened subtly on the paper, anchoring herself against the swell of fury that wanted to break the clean line of her voice. He didn't apologize, she continued. He didn't step back. He smiled wider, like my being young wasn't a barrier. It was the prize. Jasmine paused then, letting the sickening weight of those words sink in. Across the room there was a visible shudder, an almost physical recoil from faces who had until moments ago sat in easy judgment. Jasmine lowered the page just slightly, her voice now as sharp and cold as a blade drawn under the skin. When she said she was 16, James Woods looked at her, Jasmine said, slow and deliberate, and answered, even better. The phrase didn't echo like a shout. It landed like a stone dropped in a deep well, heavy and sickening, impossible to pull back. The cameras zoomed tighter, catching every crack forming in Wood's expression. The forced tightness of his jaw, the shallow, rapid breaths he couldn't quite hide. Jasmine stood silent for a moment after, letting the truth radiate outward, refusing to rush past it, refusing to let the room pretend it hadn't heard. It wasn't just an accusation anymore. It was a memory dragged into the harsh light, undeniable, unsanitized, and irreversible. Jasmine let the silence thicken, let the horror of the truth settle like a weight across every heart in the room. And then, with a voice as calm as it was devastating, she asked the question no one could unhear. She straightened slowly, her hands resting lightly on the table, her gaze never wavering from the man squirming across from her. Her voice was quiet, almost gentle, but the blade hidden within it gleamed sharper than ever. Tell me, Mr. Woods, Jasmine said, her words deliberate, each syllable carrying the weight of a verdict long overdue. When you defend free speech so fiercely, she leaned in just slightly, not to intimidate, but to ensure there was no escape, no chance to pretend this wasn't real. Does your definition include the freedom to prey on children? A gasp tore through the studio, not loud but raw, the collective exhale of a room that had suddenly realized it was standing on the edge of something vast and ugly. The question hung in the air like a live wire, and for the first time all night, the man who had wrapped himself in outrage looked small, exposed, and cornered. James Wood's face flushed an angry, blotchy red, the veins at his temples pulsing with a visible fury he could no longer control. He shifted in his seat, fists clenching and unclenching, searching for words sharp enough to cut through the noose tightening around him. When he finally spoke, his voice was no longer cold or calculated. It was raw, ragged, rising almost to a shout. This is what they do, he barked, his fingers stabbing wildly at the air, not even directly at Jasmine anymore, but at the idea of her, at the threat she represented. They twist the truth. They criminalize speech. His words cracked under the weight of their own desperation, and the crowd reacted not with cheers, but with uneasy shifting. a ripple of discomfort that spread like a stain. Freedom is under siege, Woods roared, his voice pitching higher, losing the measured cadence that had once made him seem formidable. The camera zoomed in tight, catching every bead of sweat, every desperate gleam in his eyes, every jagged line of a man unraveling under the pressure of the truth. Jasmine remained motionless, her silence louder than any retort, while Woods raged against an invisible enemy, his anger feeding on itself as the studio seemed to grow smaller, heavier, crushing down around him. In that moment, it became terrifyingly clear. This wasn't a man defending freedom. It was a man fighting to outrun the reckoning that had finally caught him. As Wood's fury burned itself into exhaustion, Jasmine moved, not with noise, but with the devastating calm of someone who understood that real power didn't shout, it simply stood. Jasmine leaned slightly forward, her hands folded neatly on the table, her voice slicing through the thick, battered air like a scalpel through old scar tissue. Freedom, she said, soft but unstoppable, cannot be a shield for moral decay. The words hit the studio like a detonation, quieter but infinitely more destructive than any shout. Instantly, the room split down an invisible fault line, two opposing currents of belief crashing violently into one another. On one side, furious applause erupted, raw and wild, fists pumping in solidarity. On the other, a wave of boos and angry shouts rose like a wounded animal, fighting back against the pain of recognition. The moderator tried to speak, tried to regain control, but his words were drowned under the sheer force of the collision Jasmine had unleashed. Woods lurched forward again, his mouth opening to retort, but whatever came out was swallowed by the roar of the audience, the studio lights glaring like judgmental gods. Jasmine's voice, though soft, carried the weight of 1,000 silenced truths, and she did not stop there. Freedom demands responsibility, Jasmine continued, her voice gaining the weight of iron forged in fire. And when we defend the indefensible under the banner of liberty, we are not protecting democracy, we are poisoning it from within. Jasmine didn't move. She sat still in the center of the chaos, the eye of the storm she had summoned, unshaken as the truths she spoke ripped through the carefully constructed illusions around her. In that moment, it was no longer just a debate. It was a reckoning, and every person watching knew they had crossed a line they could never uncross. As Jasmine's words settled into the broken air, like shards of glass, the tension inside the studio finally snapped. Not into silence, but into something far louder, far more dangerous. At first, it was a single sound, a lone pair of hands clapping somewhere near the front rows, sharp and defiant. Then another, and another. The applause grew rapidly, erupting from pockets of the audience like sparks catching dry brush, until half the studio was on its feet, roaring their approval for Jasmine Crockett. Their faces burned with righteous fury, their cheers raw with the kind of cathartic release that only comes when truth punches a hole through the thick walls of polite deception. They clapped not just for her words, but for every moment they had been told to sit down, to stay quiet, to swallow injustice whole, and call it unity. Jasmine remained still at the table, letting the sound crash over her like a storm she had always known was coming, her face unreadable, carved in the calm of someone who understood that victory wasn't noise, it was surviving the flood. But across the studio, another sound rose like a counterwave, the harsh, guttural roars of those who would not, could not, let go of the narrative they had wrapped around themselves like a shield. Supporters of Woods shot to their feet, their faces twisted in anger, fists pumping the air, shouting words that tangled together into a messy cacophony. Fake. Lies. Freedom. Their eyes burned with the desperate rage of people who felt the ground shifting under them, and who chose, in their terror, to build walls of noise instead of bridges of understanding. The air between the two factions vibrated, invisible and electric, as if the very molecules refused to stay neutral anymore. In the back rows, security guards tensed, their hands hovering near earpieces, reading the shift in energy with professional dread. It wasn't just noise now. It was something wilder, something close to combustion. The moderators' faces paled under the bright studio lights, their prepared scripts forgotten, their stage directions meaningless in the face of a crowd no longer willing to be directed. The cameras, hungry for the drama, panned wide, catching it all. The angry pointing, the furious shouting, the faces twisted in disbelief, in vindication, in raw, unfiltered rage. Jasmine stayed seated, but it was clear she controlled the center of the storm now. Woods stood too, but his movements were jerky, reactive, the stance of a man who was no longer leading, but desperately following the noise of his own crumbling army. He tried to speak again, thrusting a hand toward the camera as if reaching for the public itself, but his words were swallowed by the maelstrom before they even fully formed. "You see?" he shouted hoarsely, though few heard him clearly. "You see what they do? They want to silence us. They want to erase us." His voice cracked at the edges, the once sharp weapon of his charisma now dulled into a blunt, ugly instrument, swinging wildly in a room that was no longer listening. The supporters who clapped for Jasmine grew louder, stronger, their cheers taking on a chant-like rhythm, pounding the walls, drowning out Wood's desperate cries. "Truth! Truth! Truth!" they roared, not just for her, but for themselves, for the years they had spent unseen, unheard, dismissed. Meanwhile, Woods' defenders screamed back their own chants, jagged and furious. "USA! USA! USA!" A battle cry twisted into a wall of denial, as if patriotism could erase the stench of what had just been exposed. The clash of sound became a physical thing, a living beast that filled the space between Jasmine and Woods, between past and present, between the story America told itself and the story now bleeding out under the harsh, merciless lights. Sweat poured down Woods' face, his jacket sagging off his shoulders as if even the fabric had given up trying to hold him upright. Jasmine remained composed, almost eerily so, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her expression a calm fury burning at the exact temperature where metal bends, but does not break. For a brief moment, a chant from Woods' side faltered, sputtered out as a camera zoomed in tight. Not on Jasmine's poised stillness, but on Woods' trembling hands. It was a small thing, almost invisible in the chaos, but it was enough. Enough to plant the first seeds of doubt in the minds of even his fiercest defenders. Enough to splinter the certainty that had fueled their rage. And Jasmine felt it. That subtle shift, that moment when noise starts to turn against itself. She didn't gloat. She didn't even smile. She simply leaned into her microphone, waiting for just the smallest pocket of space to open amid the roar, and spoke again, quiet, steady, undeniable. "You can shout down the truth," she said, her voice threading through the chaos like a silver blade, "but you cannot erase it." The words didn't crash or explode. They moved differently. They burrowed, lodged deep, in places anger couldn't reach, in places fear couldn't silence. And as the studio shook with the fury of a nation tearing itself along ancient, still bleeding lines, Jasmine Crockett sat unbowed, the living embodiment of a truth too long buried and far too powerful now to be ignored. As the chants and shouts clashed around her like storm waves battering a cliff, Jasmine moved with the slow, lethal certainty of someone holding not just an argument, but the final, irrefutable blow. Jasmine reached calmly into her folder again, her movements almost reverent, as if she were preparing to place the final stone on a monument built not from victory, but from survival. The paper she pulled out this time was heavier, thicker, not just in weight, but in meaning. She set it flat on the table, unfolding it with the kind of steady hands that spoke louder than any shouting voice could. Then, without a single glance toward the chaos around her, she lifted her eyes to James Woods and began. "This," she said, her voice carrying over the storm with the gravity of a judge pronouncing sentence, "is what you forgot, Mr. Woods. What you hoped no one would dare bring into the light." She tapped the first page lightly with one fingertip, and the screen behind them flickered to life, filling with projected posts, screenshots of James Woods' own words, torn from the angry depths of social media, now laid bare under the merciless studio lights. One by one, the images flashed across the screen. A post accusing immigrants of infesting America, dripping with the language of dehumanization. A meme mocking victims of racial violence, laughed off as jokes too edgy for the woke mob. A conspiracy theory-laced rant accusing female accusers of being paid actresses sent by Soros. Each post, each sneer, each festering lie built upon the last, forming a towering indictment of the man who had spent the evening howling about the purity of free speech. The crowd shifted again, a new current of horror moving through both sides of the divided room. Even among those who had stood cheering for Woods minutes earlier, heads turned toward the giant screen, faces tightening with discomfort, with doubt. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply let the evidence speak for itself, every hateful syllable echoing longer and heavier than any shouted defense. She turned the page. And it didn't stop with words, Jasmine continued, her voice now a scalpel peeling back the layers of rot. When women like Amber Tamblyn spoke out, when young girls had the courage to name what had been done to them, what did you do, Mr. Woods? Her tone hardened, not into rage, but into something colder, something heavier. You mocked them. You accused them of lying. You planted the seeds of doubt with every follower you could reach, every microphone you could grab. You didn't defend your innocence. You attacked their right to be heard. The screen behind her shifted again, this time showing leaked emails, communications sent from Woods' representatives to media outlets, attempting to discredit the women before they even finished telling their stories. Unreliable, one email read. Known for attention-seeking. Questionable mental health, another sneered. Every tactic as old as power itself, to destroy not the accusation, but the accuser. The audience had stopped moving now. The chants had sputtered into stunned silence. Only the hum of the lights and the sharp breathing of the people remained, filling the void where certainty had once lived. Even Woods' own supporters seemed paralyzed, their anger caught mid-throat, their fists falling limply to their sides. James Woods himself sat motionless, color draining from his face, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned bone white. Sweat carved bright tracks down his cheeks. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but no words came. There was nothing left to say. Jasmine saw it, the collapse, the crumbling, but she gave no smile, no gesture of triumph. She simply leaned a fraction closer to her microphone, her voice dropping into the kind of deadly calm that no storm could shake. "Tell me, Mr. Woods," Jasmine said, her words sharp as broken glass, each one deliberate and merciless, slicing through the thick, choking air. "Do you truly believe that this—" She gestured toward the damning images still glowing behind her. "Is freedom?" She paused, letting the silence after her words settle like a heavy, final stone. "Or is it just the freedom to deceive, to destroy, and to call it patriotism when what you really want?" Her voice softened, the blade twisting with surgical precision. "Is the freedom to never be held accountable?" The lights seemed to burn brighter in that instant, casting every flaw into brutal clarity. The sweat on Wood's brow, the tremor in his hands, the wreckage of a man exposed not by someone else's words but by his own. Jasmine sat back slowly, her hands folded once more in front of her, unmoving, the quiet force of a truth no amount of shouting could bury again. The studio remained frozen, a breathing, living testament to the reckoning they had all just witnessed. In that moment, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument. She didn't just defeat an opponent. She shattered a fortress of lies and made everyone in that room and everyone watching remember what it felt like to finally hear the truth without apology. For a moment, it seemed Woods might hold it together. But truth, once spoken, has a way of pulling apart even the thickest armor, and all he had left now was anger sharpened into desperation. James Woods lurched forward in his chair, his hands no longer steady, his breathing no longer controlled, his face, once carved in smug defiance, now twisted into a mask of rage, veins standing out on his neck, the fury in his eyes no longer political. It was personal. He slammed a fist against the table, the sound sharp and ugly in the charged silence. And when he spoke, his voice was no longer the voice of a seasoned debater or a clever manipulator. It was the voice of a man unmasked. "You're nothing but a puppet," he barked, the words cracking in the air. A diversity hire dressed up in self-righteousness. His voice rose higher, ragged and raw. You don't care about truth. You care about power. You don't speak for justice. You speak for yourself. His words spiraled, faster, harder, laced now with something more poisonous than anger. Fear. You want to tear down everything good about this country just to make room for your own grievance theater. He spat, eyes wild, pointing a shaking finger directly at Jasmine as if trying to reduce her existence to an offense against him. The words echoed for a breath, sharp, hateful, naked in their cruelty. Jasmine didn't react. She didn't flinch. She simply sat there, calm as a stone in the river, letting his rage crash and break against her silence. Around them, the energy in the room shifted, darkened. Where there had once been noise, applause, chants, shouted loyalty, now there was only a heavy, suffocating stillness. One by one, faces in the crowd hardened. Eyes that had moments before burned with furious loyalty began to flicker with something colder. Disgust, betrayal, recognition. Cameras caught everything. The twisting anger in Woods' face, the raw desperation cracking through his voice, the spit gathering at the corners of his mouth as he ranted against a woman who had not once raised her voice. They caught the faces in the audience, caught the slow turning away of heads, the folding of arms across chests, the way some of his own supporters suddenly couldn't quite meet his eyes. It wasn't a dramatic shift. It wasn't a single gasp or a shouted protest. It was something worse, a slow, creeping rejection, like the way a tide pulls away from a body left too long on the shore. James Woods didn't notice, or maybe he did. Maybe some deep, frightened part of him realized he had gone too far, but pride was a beast that would not let him retreat. He raged on, voice cracking, the ugliness pouring out of him, unfiltered now. "You're not a leader," he sneered, jabbing the air. "You're a parasite, feeding on guilt, feeding on division. You don't love this country, you hate it, and you want to tear it down because you know you'll never build anything real yourself." The words hung there, raw and exposed, and for the first time all night no one rushed to fill the silence they left behind. The audience stayed frozen, a living portrait of realization. The realization that this was not the voice of freedom, this was not the voice of patriotism, this was the voice of bitterness, dressed up in slogans, the voice of a man who, when stripped of his careful rhetoric, could only offer cruelty. The hurt, the fear, the resentment, all laid bare for everyone to see. Jasmine sat unmoving, the gravity around her growing heavier with every passing second. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. The truth had already been spoken, and now the world was watching what came after the fall. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was the final judgment. More people in the audience began to look away. Some crossed their arms. Others shook their heads slowly. A few started gathering their things, not in protest, but in something even more final. Disappointment. That rare, terrible silence when you realize the hero you defended was never standing on solid ground at all, just propped up on lies you no longer had the strength to carry. Wood's shoulders slumped fractionally, the weight of the moment finally beginning to pierce even the thick armor of his rage. He stood isolated now, a furious, sweating figure flailing against a tide that had already turned. His words came softer, broken almost, as if even he could hear how hollow they sounded now. "They'll see," he muttered, barely loud enough to reach the first row. "They'll see what you really are." But no one was listening anymore. Not to him. The silence was a verdict, and it was deafening. The silence was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a space carved open, waiting for one final truth to be laid inside it. And Jasmine Crockett rose into that space like a force too long denied. Jasmine stood slowly, not in triumph, not in rage, but in something far deeper, the slow, inevitable rising of a tide that no wall of denial could hold back. The air around her shimmered with tension, the lights overhead burning hotter, brighter, as if the universe itself had leaned closer to witness what came next. She didn't rush. Every movement was deliberate, grounded, as if she carried the weight of generations who had waited for this moment without ever daring to believe it would come. Her eyes never left Woods, who remained slumped in his seat, a broken thing trying and failing to gather the shattered pieces of his fury around him. His hands twitched against the table. His lips trembled with words he could no longer summon. The sweat that had once been a shimmer was now a sheen, glistening under the pitiless lights that spared no flaw, no failure. Jasmine reached for the microphone, her fingers steady, her expression composed, not cold, but burning with a fire that needed no fuel except the truth it carried. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it filled the room more completely than any shout could have. It wasn't designed to drown anything out. It was designed to cut through, to last. "The truth," Jasmine said, her voice low, rich with the gravity of survival, of battles fought long before this night and sure to be fought long after, "does not need to scream to be real." She let the first sentence settle, watched it land on the skin of the crowd like heat on iron. "The truth does not need to pound its fists against the door," she continued, her tone sharpening just slightly, "because the door was never strong enough to keep it out in the first place." The cameras inched closer, slow and reverent, the operators understanding instinctively that something irreversible was happening. Not just to Woods, not just to Jasmine, but to everyone who had ever believed that the old walls would always hold. Jasmine took a half step forward, not aggressive, not threatening, but inevitable, like a storm front pushing across a helpless plain. She let her gaze sweep the studio, taking in the faces turned toward her, some open, some fearful, some stunned, and then finally returned her focus to the man who had shouted so loudly for freedom without ever understanding what it meant. "And when the lies crumble," Jasmine said, her voice softer now, nearly a whisper but still carrying through the room like a hammer blow, softened only by its certainty, "the truth doesn't chase the wreckage." Her next words came with the precision of a final nail being driven into a coffin that had been waiting too long to be closed. "The truth simply stands." She leaned closer to the microphone, and the lights caught the fierce, quiet blaze in her eyes. A blaze not born of anger, but of something far more unstoppable. Faith. Faith in the simple, unyielding power of what was real. Faith in the idea that no amount of shouting, no wall of denial, no fortress of wealth or privilege or fear could hold back the sunrise forever. And then, the words that would tear through the world, that would be replayed in headlines, in hashtags, in the whispered prayers of people who had nearly forgotten what courage sounded like. "The truth does not need to scream. It only needs to stand and wait for the weak to collapse." The words hung there, a living thing, pulsing, undeniable, as the cameras caught everything. Caught James Wood's face, pale now, the anger drained away, leaving only the hollow shell of a man who had been measured and found wanting. Caught the tremor in his hands, the wet gleam in his eyes, the sag of his shoulders. Caught the faces in the crowd, some awash in tears, some set hard with new resolve, some simply stunned into silence. The armor of cynicism shattered. Caught the moderator, standing uselessly at his podium, mouth half open, realizing too late that history had already passed him by. The camera panned wider, slower, capturing the full tableau. Woods, sunken and broken under the hard, brutal light. Jasmine, standing bright and unshakable, the light seeming to radiate from her rather than onto her. Captured the studio itself, no longer a battleground, but something older and deeper. A courtroom without a judge, because the verdict had already been delivered. Captured a moment that, once seen, could not be unseen. In the control room, producers stared at their monitors, frozen, understanding they had just broadcast something bigger than scandal, bigger than politics. They had broadcast a reckoning. Phones buzzed across the nation, screens lit up, feeds exploded. The moment didn't just go viral, it tore through the digital world like wildfire through dry grass. Truth stands began trending before Jasmine had even lowered her hand from the microphone. Clips of Wood's collapse and Jasmine's final words looped endlessly, shared by millions who found in them something they had not realized they were starving for. A glimpse of strength that didn't need to shout to shatter the old foundations. Something clean, something unbought, something unafraid. And even as the moderators tried to regain control, even as studio techs scrambled to prepare for commercial breaks, even as spin doctors on both sides drafted frantic statements to contextualize the night, none of it mattered. The truth was out. It stood. And nothing, not rage, not denial, not even the long, grinding inertia of history, could push it back into the dark again. As the final shot tightened one last time, the cameras did not linger on Woods. They lingered on Jasmine Crockett, face calm, eyes fierce, shoulders steady, standing not as a symbol, not as a slogan, but as a living, breathing answer to the question that had hung over the night. What happens when the truth stops whispering and simply refuses to move? And as the screen finally, slowly faded to black, it was not the chaos that followed, which the world would remember. It was the stillness. It was the clarity. It was the fire, burning clean and undeniable, in the eyes of the woman who never needed to shout to win. The blackout on the studio monitors lasted exactly 3 seconds. But outside those walls in the restless wired veins of America, it was more than enough. 3 seconds for 1 million screenshots to be captured. 3 seconds for thousands of people to fumble for their phones with shaking hands. 3 seconds for the world to inhale and feel, deep in its bones, that something enormous had just broken free. In living rooms, diners, crowded airports, midnight shift factories, and college dormitories, the final image burned across screens. Jasmine Crockett, standing tall and unflinching under the blinding studio lights, and James Woods, slumped and sweat-drenched across from her, looking not like a fighter for freedom, but like a man trying to claw his way out of quicksand. It wasn't just a clip anymore. It was a rupture, clean, violent, irreversible. Within 60 seconds, the first hashtags were born. Truth stands, the collapse. Crockett moment. Simple at first, a ripple, a shudder, but growing, swelling, accelerating with a velocity that no PR team, no media spin, no political machinery could slow down. At 11:04 p.m. Eastern, the first viral tweet exploded, a side-by-side still image, Jasmine, poised and radiant, Woods small and crumbling, with 4 devastating words typed underneath, "The old world is dying." By 11:10 p.m., it had been retweeted 500,000 times. By 11:15 p.m., it was being translated into Spanish, Korean, Arabic, French. By 11:20 p.m., it had crossed oceans. Newsrooms scrambled. Producers barked orders into headsets. Panelists abandoned their pre-written talking points and stumbled to react in real time. Analysts tried to reframe the moment, to contain it, but every attempt sounded hollow against the raw footage being replayed endlessly, mercilessly. Jasmine standing, speaking a truth so simple it detonated decades of false narratives. Woods raging, unraveling, breaking. On YouTube, reaction videos flooded in like a dam had burst. Teenagers, teachers, veterans, activists, even celebrities blinking into their webcams, saying variations of the same thing. Did you see that? Did you feel it? Something changed tonight. Talk radio hosts who had spent years mocking wokeness stuttered and stumbled. Some doubled down, frothing about liberal traps, but their words rang with a desperation too naked to hide. Others, quieter and more calculating, pivoted mid-broadcast, sensing which way the wind now howled. Editorial boards huddled overnight, arguments breaking out behind closed doors. What headline could possibly fit? What spin could possibly stitch the old story back together? By midnight, the story had outpaced them all. No longer was it about policy or talking points or party loyalty. It was about power, about the sickening realization that for too long, power had been defended with noise. And that night, someone had stood up and simply let the silence do the bleeding. Viral clips focused on Jasmine's closing line. The truth does not need to scream. It only needs to stand and wait for the weak to collapse. Some spliced it into songs. Others carved it into stark, black and white GIFs that repeated endlessly, like a slow drumbeat in the collective mind. Artists began sketching her pose, standing alone under a collapsing storm, within hours. Political memes, protest signs, graffiti walls in Brooklyn, Oakland, Atlanta, all carried the image of Jasmine standing firm while the old guard crumbled around her. On Reddit, subforums lit up with discussions far deeper than the usual partisan chatter. This wasn't about left or right, one post read, upvoted 70,000 times in minutes. This was about someone finally refusing to be baited into a screaming match and just letting the truth do what it always eventually does, burn the lies to the ground. In high school classrooms the next morning, teachers found their students already quoting her words before the first bell rang. In downtown cafes, laptops glowed with the freeze frame of Woods' collapse, an image passed around with a mix of awe and quiet, solemn satisfaction. Uber drivers talked about it between fares. Baristas wrote numbered truth stands in foam atop lattes. Tattoo shops reported appointments booked for the weekend. Jasmine's final words etched into skin. But not everyone celebrated. In smoky backrooms, political strategists pounded tables, furious at how quickly their narratives had been swept away like sand in a flash flood. Conservative megadonors convened emergency meetings. Crisis PR firms scrambled to dig up old controversies, anything that might tarnish Jasmine's sudden, searing ascendancy. It didn't matter. By the time they understood the scale of what had happened, it was already too late. The beauty and the terror of viral truth was that it could not be unmade. No amount of op-eds, no amount of carefully curated interviews could scrub the image now burned into the public's collective retina. A woman standing calm in the center of a storm, letting the old world tear itself apart around her. Cable news tried to frame it in their usual partisan binaries. Was Crockett's attack too harsh? Is free speech under siege? Was Woods ambushed? But the public didn't care about the frames anymore. They cared about the feeling, the electric, breathless clarity of watching someone refuse to be baited, refuse to drown, refuse to apologize for demanding better. By 2 a.m., Jasmine Crockett's follower count had tripled. By 2:30 a.m., shirts with her quote were being printed in basement shops and Etsy stores. By 3 a.m., the first think pieces began to appear, but they read like aftershocks, not earthquakes. The earthquake had already come. The landscape was already different. In some corners, Wood's most loyal defenders raged on, but their numbers dwindled by the hour. Their tweets grew angrier, more frantic, more conspiratorial. They screamed about censorship, about persecution, about witch hunts. But the power behind their noise was gone, drained away by the simple, devastating optics of the night before. The new world wasn't shaped by their shouting anymore. It was shaped by the sight of a woman who didn't need to scream, who stood. And as the sun began to rise over a shaken, blinking America, the hashtags hadn't slowed. They had only grown fiercer, stronger, carving themselves into history. Truth stands. Crockett moment, the collapse. This was not the end of a conversation. This was not a scandal to be papered over. This was not a gotcha moment. This was a fire, a wildfire, and nothing could put it out now. The doors of the studio swung open with a soft, mechanical hiss, but to Jasmine Crockett, the sound seemed deafening against the heavy silence clinging to her skin. For a moment, she stood just beyond the threshold, caught between two worlds, the one she had just cracked open behind her, and the unknown, trembling one waiting outside. The night air hit her in the face, cold and sharp, as if the universe itself had been holding its breath and now, finally, dared to exhale. Behind her, the building still glowed under the unforgiving lights, the place where a carefully built lie had collapsed, and where a single steady voice had torn through the noise without ever raising above a whisper. Ahead, the city sprawled wide and waiting, its lights flickering like 1,000 small, uncertain stars. Somewhere beyond those lights, she knew, the world was already changing. Not in sweeping parades or roaring applause, but in smaller, fiercer ways. In the quiet reshuffling of hearts, in the invisible tilting of the old cracked ground. Jasmine didn't look back. She didn't have to. What had needed to fall had already fallen. What remained was the walking forward. And she understood, perhaps better than anyone, how heavy each step would feel. Her aides rushed to catch up, breathless and wide-eyed, phones glued to their ears, their voices urgent and overlapping. "You're trending everywhere. CNN wants a live statement. The New York Times is already calling it the moment of the decade. Madam Crockett, they're asking if you'll consider a presidential run." She nodded once but said nothing. Words felt too small for this moment. The work ahead, she knew, was not in riding the wave of attention. It was in surviving it, shaping it, refusing to let it be twisted into something smaller than it was meant to be. The cameras hadn't followed her out into the night, not yet, but she could feel their hunger trailing just behind, like wolves sniffing at the heels of something they couldn't quite name. She heard the distant murmur of reporters gathering at the curb, their questions sharpening even before they had been spoken. "Congresswoman, did you mean to destroy his career? Was that moment rehearsed? How does it feel to be the face of a movement?" Jasmine knew every question before it came. She knew the headlines they would try to write. She knew the boxes they would try to force her into. Hero, villain, symbol, threat. But she wasn't walking for their headlines. She was walking for something older, deeper. She was walking for the people whose names would never trend, whose truths would never go viral, but whose lives deserved the same unyielding standing place she had fought for tonight. Her heels clicked softly against the pavement as she moved forward, every step steady, measured. The darkness pressed against her from all sides, thick and heavy, but she carried her own light now. Not the borrowed, blinding glare of studio lights, but something steadier, something born of bone and memory and resolve. The wind picked up, tugging at the hem of her coat, whispering through the streets like a song too old to have a beginning. Jasmine pulled it tighter around her shoulders and kept walking. Across the street, she caught sight of her own face flashing on a giant television screen in the window of a late-night bar. There she was, frozen in that final moment, eyes unblinking, mouth firm, shoulders set against the weight of everything crashing around her. The sound was muted, but she didn't need to hear the words scrolling across the screen to know what they said. She looked away, not out of fear or false humility, but out of understanding. The work was never in the moment they caught you standing. It was in the thousand silent steps that came after. Near the corner, a young woman in a sweatshirt and jeans stopped mid-stride, her phone forgotten in her hand, staring openly at Jasmine. Recognition flared in her eyes, not the brittle awe reserved for celebrities, but something deeper, the stunned, wordless realization of someone seeing themselves reflected in a place they had been told they would never belong. Jasmine met her gaze and gave the barest of nods. Not permission, not absolution, but acknowledgement. The girl smiled, tentative but wide, and Jasmine smiled back, the corners of her mouth lifting just slightly before she turned once more toward the waiting dark. Behind her, the studio doors closed with a heavy mechanical thud. Ahead, the city breathed. Somewhere a siren wailed. Somewhere a neon sign flickered. Somewhere a clock ticked, marking the first minutes of a world that could never go back to what it was before. And Jasmine Crockett walked forward into it. Not as a savior, not as a symbol, but as a woman who had simply refused to collapse. The cameras would catch up eventually. The stories would pile up like fallen leaves. The power brokers and pundits would spin and twist and claw. But none of it would matter. Not anymore. Because the truth, the real, stubborn, shining truth, was already moving faster than any of them could chase. It was moving in 1,000 small steps, in 1,000 unseen hearts, in the silent, stubborn rising of people who understood now, finally, that they didn't need to scream to be heard. They only needed to stand. And as Jasmine disappeared down the long, empty street, the faint glow of her figure slipping into the deep folds of the city, the world, broken and bewildered, began to reshape itself in her wake. The lesson was never about who shouted the loudest or who threw the sharpest accusation. It was never about winning a moment on a debate stage or delivering the perfect viral quote. The lesson, carved into the bones of that night, was about what happens when truth refuses to back down, when it stands quietly, steadily, under the crushing weight of systems designed to silence it. Jasmine Crockett had faced a storm of noise, of contempt, of centuries-old dismissals sharpened into new, modern weapons. She had been baited, mocked, targeted, not just as a politician, but as a woman, as a person of color, as a symbol of everything the old world feared losing. And yet she had not screamed. She had not begged for space. She had not demanded respect. She had simply held her ground until the lies collapsed under their own emptiness. The human heart, battered by years of cynicism and noise, recognized something real in that moment, something that did not need to be explained, only witnessed. That the strongest voices are not the ones that dominate the room by force, but the ones that survive the fire and still whisper the truth afterward. That dignity, when held long enough and fiercely enough, could fracture even the tallest walls of power without lifting a fist. In a world addicted to outrage, to spectacle, to the constant, exhausting churn of conflict, Jasmine Crockett had done the unthinkable. She had made stillness louder than screams. She had forced the world to feel the weight of what it had long tried to ignore. That justice is not born in noise. It is revealed when noise is stripped away. The lesson was brutal in its simplicity and terrible in its demand. True strength is not the ability to destroy your enemy in public. True strength is the refusal to become your enemy in the process. It is the patience to let arrogance expose itself. It is the courage to speak when it is dangerous. And to stand silent when speaking would make you no different than those who weaponize sound to cover their fear. Jasmine's battle was not just against James Woods. It was against a culture that rewarded rage, that mistook volume for virtue, that taught the powerful they could outshout the truth forever. And that night, she didn't just prove them wrong, she made the whole world feel how wrong they had been, down to the marrow of their bones. In every click, every replay, every stunned silence that followed, there was a quiet, undeniable reckoning. The future would not belong to those who screamed loudest. It would belong to those who stood when everything tried to push them down, and who refused to vanish. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below, and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In just one hearing, Jasmine Crockett forced Michael Cohen, the man once closest to the highest power in the United States, to confess to a $400 million international money laundering network. Jasmine didn't just expose corruption, she revealed how greed had swallowed an entire democracy. The moment Cohen broke wasn't just a scandal. It sparked a movement demanding a new revolution in financial justice. What did Jasmine Crockett say that shook even Washington to its core? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The summons went out with the force of a thunderclap across Washington. An emergency hearing, called not for policy or posturing, but for a reckoning. The marble columns of the Capitol seemed to lean inward, as if the building itself was bracing for impact. The subject was brutal in its clarity, investigating systemic corruption, exposing the lawyers who had turned financial fraud into a dark art. At the heart of it all sat a name America could not forget: Michael Cohen. Once the whisper in every gilded hallway, now the man dragged into the light by the weight of his own betrayals. Cameras packed the hearing room like vultures, lenses wide and hungry for blood. Congressional staffers shifted nervously in their seats, sensing the storm Jasmine Crockett was about to unleash. The nation wasn't here for compromise. It was here for truth, sharpened to a blade. Every second ticked louder than the last, an invisible drumbeat announcing that something was about to break. Jasmine Crockett entered the hearing chamber without fanfare. Yet the air changed the moment she crossed the threshold. She wore no armor but her presence, no weapons but her voice, and yet the temperature seemed to drop 3 degrees. Every eye snapped to her: reporters, lawmakers, aides. Even the marble busts of forgotten leaders seemed to tilt toward her, as if history itself were paying attention. She carried a thick folder under her arm, the edges bristling with classified documents, sealed indictments, and financial trails that glowed like lit fuses. Today, the old games of money and silence would not save anyone. Michael Cohen would answer for the empire he helped build, or he would burn with it. Jasmine paused only once. her hand brushing lightly against the polished oak table, where justice at long last would be demanded. She did not smile. She did not blink. She was not here to debate. She was here to demolish. The silence that swallowed the room after Jasmine's challenge was broken only by the soft, deliberate creak of the chamber door. Michael Cohen entered like a man walking onto a battlefield he could not escape. His suit, once a symbol of his polished power, hung awkwardly on him now, as if it too had grown tired of the weight he carried. His face, once so practiced in arrogance, was pale and drawn, his eyes darting not with confidence, but calculation, flickering from Jasmine to the cameras, to the rows of lawmakers waiting like a firing squad. Each step he took seemed to hesitate just a fraction longer than necessary, as though part of him wished he could still turn back, disappear into the marble shadows. But there was no escape now. The world had cornered him, and Jasmine Crockett stood ready to light the fire. His fingers twitched at the folder he clutched. Empty gestures of control that convinced no one. This wasn't the Michael Cohen who once threatened journalists and greased political wheels. This was a man stripped of allies, stripped of armor, dragged naked before the conscience of a nation. And in the way his jaw tightened as he approached the witness table, there was one final, desperate truth. He would not go down without trying to rewrite the story, even now. For a moment, just a heartbeat, the room itself seemed to slip backward into memory. Flashes of Michael Cohen's past flared like sparks in a dry forest. In smoky back rooms, his voice had slithered through negotiations, promising protection to the highest bidder. In shadowed bank offices, he had drawn up shell companies like a magician pulling rabbits from thin air. False fronts to hide millions, transactions built like puzzles no outsider could solve. A whisper here, a threat there, a signature slipped across a table with a smile too sharp to be sincere. Cohen had not simply played the game of corruption. He had designed the board it was played on and sold the pieces to anyone willing to pay. Behind every real estate scam, every inflated asset, every hidden account, there was his hand, careful, invisible, deadly. And for years, the world had let him slip by because he spoke the language of wealth, because he shook the right hands and crushed the right enemies. But not today. Today, the marble walls would not shield him. Today, the old ghosts he had once conjured for others would rise. And Jasmine Crockett, standing like judgment itself, was ready to force every last one of them into the light. The room seemed to hold its breath as Michael Cohen settled into the witness chair, the hollow scrape of wood against marble slicing through the tense silence. His hands fumbled slightly with the papers in front of him, but no document could shield him now. Across the expanse of polished oak, Jasmine Crockett straightened slowly, every movement deliberate, as if drawing back the string of a bow. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto Cohen's with a precision that made even seasoned reporters flinch behind their cameras. There was no hesitation in her posture, no veneer of political courtesy. Only the inevitability of confrontation, humming in the stale air like the crackle before a storm. Cohen licked his lips once, an involuntary twitch that betrayed the rising tide of dread, clawing up his spine. He had faced prosecutors before, had danced through depositions and inquiries. But this was different. Jasmine was not hunting a headline. She was hunting something far rarer, the truth he had buried long ago. She didn't waste a second. Jasmine leaned forward, her voice low but slicing through the air like tempered steel. "Mr. Cohen," she said, every syllable hammered into the silence. A man who understood the law better than most, yet chose to grind it under his heel. Why? The question hit the room like a detonation, sharp, sudden, and leaving no safe place to hide. A murmur ran through the gallery, a ripple of shock that even decades of political theater could not suppress. For a moment after Jasmine's words fell like a hammer onto the room, nothing moved. Even the air seemed frozen in place, heavy with anticipation, almost crackling with the weight of what was about to happen. Every pair of eyes, from seasoned senators to jittery junior aides, locked onto Michael Cohen as if the force of their stares alone could peel the truth from his skin. Cohen sat motionless at first, his breathing shallow, The thin veneer of composure stretched tight across his face, ready to tear. Under the ruthless assault of the lights and cameras, his defenses, so meticulously built over years of courtroom battles and backroom deals, began to crumble. He blinked, swallowed hard, glanced down at the papers before him like they might offer an escape. But there were no words on earth that could save him from what Jasmine Crockett had unleashed. He shifted in his seat, a small, twitchy movement that only made the silence scream louder. Then, almost reluctantly, as if dragged to the gallows, he spoke. His voice was low, frayed at the edges, the voice of a man trying to thread a needle of sympathy through a fabric soaked in guilt. "I was following orders," Cohen said, his voice spilling out too fast, too thin, as if trying to outrun the shame curling behind every word. He darted a glance at the committee members, hoping for some flicker of understanding, but found only cold stone. "You have to understand, the environment we were in, the expectations, everyone knew how the game was played," he said, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. "It wasn't about right or wrong, it was about survival, about loyalty. You cut corners, you bend the rules because that's what the system demands." He raised a hand as if trying to shield himself from the weight of their stares. "It wasn't just me," he insisted, his voice fraying at the edges. "It was the culture. It was normal. If you didn't play along, you didn't survive." But the chamber was merciless. No one leaned forward with sympathy. In the hard, unsparing eyes that stared back at him, Cohen could already see the verdict writing itself. No matter how he twisted it, the man who had weaponized corruption could not now hide behind claims of victimhood. Still, he pressed on, clinging to the lie of helplessness. He spoke of pressures, of the slow corrosion of right and wrong in rooms where power needed no morality. But every excuse only made him smaller, more invisible, already fading from the story he thought he controlled. His voice cracked once, just slightly when he said, "I didn't have a choice," and the chamber seemed to recoil in silent disgust. Of all the lies he had spun in his lifetime, perhaps this was the most naked. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless across from him, her gaze steady, a blade she had no need to swing, because Cohen was slicing himself apart with every desperate syllable. In that courtroom of history, where facts mattered more than theatrics, Michael Cohen had become the perfect witness against himself. A man who built an empire of deceit, now reduced to a broken architect trying to blame the bricks. And as his final excuse withered and fell dead between them, Jasmine Crockett moved, not with anger, but with the merciless calm of someone who had heard every lie 1,000 times before and was ready to end them with a single cut. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her movement so controlled, so deliberate, it felt more like the drawing of a blade than the shifting of a posture. Her voice when it came was quiet, not a shout, not an accusation, but something far worse, the final, irrevocable truth. "Pressure doesn't create thieves," Jasmine said, her words slicing through the stale tension with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "It reveals them." The sentence landed not like an explosion, but like a slow, brutal breaking. The crack of something deep inside Cohen giving way at last. A collective shiver seemed to move through the room, as if the very air recoiled from the nakedness of the moment. Cohen's mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. His excuses, his practiced defenses, all turned to ash in the face of a truth too pure and too sharp to deny. Jasmine didn't press further. She didn't need to. Her words had been enough to strip him bare in front of a nation that now saw him not as a victim, not even as a villain, but as something infinitely smaller. A man who had chosen corruption not because he was forced to, but because he wanted to. The cameras zoomed closer, greedy to catch every flicker of collapse. And still Jasmine sat, composed and unflinching, the embodiment of a justice that had waited too long, but had not forgotten. The aftershock of Jasmine's last words still hung over the room like a silent roar when she moved again, slower than before, every motion deliberate and filled with quiet devastation. She didn't glance at the audience. She didn't look to the committee or the cameras. Her focus stayed locked on Michael Cohen, and in that unbroken stare was the promise of something worse than condemnation: exposure. Without rushing, without grandstanding, Jasmine reached down and retrieved a thick, sealed file from the table before her, the folder's edges slightly worn, as if it had traveled a long road to get here. The fluorescent lights caught the metal clasp as she flicked it open with a soft, metallic snap, a sound so sharp it seemed to ripple across the chamber. The journalists pressed closer against the rope barriers, their cameras whirring into a frenzy, sensing what was coming. Even the lawmakers shifted in their seats, their practiced masks of indifference slipping slightly. There was no yelling, no flourish, only the chilling finality of evidence about to be laid bare. Jasmine placed the folder on the table and slid it forward, her fingers barely brushing the surface, as if even she found the contents too heavy to fully hold. And in that simple, devastating movement, the temperature of the room dropped another degree. Her voice when she spoke again was low, controlled, without an ounce of wasted breath. "You spoke of pressure, Mr. Cohen," she said, flipping open the first page with a whisper of paper. "You spoke of culture. Let's talk about what you created." She began to read, each word deliberate, each line a blade. Company name, Goldstone Holdings, registered at a non-existent address in Newark, New Jersey. Owner, shell entity tied to a defunct firm in Belize. She turned another page without pausing. Company name, Blue Ridge Ventures. Wire transfers totaling $7.4 million, funneled through accounts in the Cayman Islands, never reported to the IRS. Another page fluttered under her fingers. Company name, Hawthorne Consulting. Payments masked as consulting fees. But the invoices are blank. No services rendered. No staff on record. Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. Each fact struck like a hammer. Calm, relentless, merciless. Jasmine's words painted the picture clearly, not of a man forced by circumstances, but of an architect who had engineered corruption with steady hands and an unshaken will. And Cohen, trapped under the brutal floodlight of truth, could do nothing now but drown. But even as the weight of his hidden empire lay exposed on the table, Jasmine was not finished. She had saved the sharpest blade for last. The final document slid to a stop on the table like the last card in a losing game. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Not even close. She let the heavy silence stretch a moment longer, watching Michael Cohen's chest rise and fall too quickly, his mouth twitching with barely controlled panic. Then, with the same cold control she had shown all along, she shifted gears. The energy in the room changed instantly, sharper and colder as Jasmine reached for a second, smaller file marked by a plain red tab. Everything before had been tightening the noose, and now she was ready to pull it. She tapped the folder once on the table, the sound soft but sharp, slicing through the room like a warning shot. The shell companies, Jasmine said, her voice even and cutting, were only the beginning. She slid the red-tabbed file to the center of the table and let it sit there like a bomb about to explode. Then, in a voice so low and deliberate that everyone leaned in to hear, she delivered the blow. "You are on the classified target list of a secret IRS investigation. Codename, Operation Taxman." The effect was immediate, even though no one in the room moved a muscle. It felt like the oxygen had been sucked out, replaced by something heavier and more dangerous. Cohen blinked rapidly, as if trying to convince himself he had heard wrong. But there was no mistake. Operation Taxman, a secret federal operation so tightly guarded that no reporter, no senator, no one outside a handful of officials had even known it existed until this very moment. Jasmine's words didn't just shake Cohen, they shattered him. She pressed on, her tone clinical, merciless. A multi-year investigation into major tax fraud, money laundering, and illegal shell networks, built by people who thought they were too powerful to be touched, she said, her gaze locking Cohen in place like a trap. And you, Mr. Cohen, were one of the first names entered into that sealed file. Every word landed harder than the last, stacking onto his chest like heavy stones, crushing the last scraps of denial he had left. He sat frozen, surrounded by the ruins of the lies he had built, while Jasmine, calm and relentless, watched as the truth finally drowned him. The silence after Jasmine's last revelation stretched so tight it seemed the air itself might tear. Cohen sat motionless, blinking as if the words classified IRS operation might rearrange themselves into something less fatal if he just refused to process them. The cameras clicked faster now, capturing every twitch of his fingers, every shallow rise and fall of his chest. Jasmine gave him no mercy, no room to retreat into denial. She allowed the silence to suffocate him a second longer, then leaned in with a stillness that was more terrifying than any shout. Her voice was calm, unshaken, almost clinical as she spoke, but the words themselves cut deeper than any blade. "Mr. Cohen," she said, her gaze locking him down like an iron vice. "Do you know why your tax fraud file was quietly transferred into a federal covert operation known as Operation Taxman?" She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She let the question hang there, jagged and bleeding, daring him to answer, knowing he couldn't. The explosion wasn't loud. It was electric. A ripple of shock tore through the hearing room, invisible but undeniable. Journalists jolted in their seats, the quiet murmur of whispered questions rising into a sudden, chaotic buzz. Hands scrambled for recording devices, cameras zoomed and refocused with frantic urgency, capturing every microscopic detail of the moment the floor dropped out beneath Michael Cohen. Behind the committee members' stoic faces, even the most battle-hardened politicians stiffened at the name. Operation Taxman. It wasn't just another investigation. It was a silent storm, gathering strength for years in the corridors of federal power, designed to crush sprawling empires of hidden wealth, black money, and untouchable names. And now, thanks to Jasmine Crockett, the whole world knew that Michael Cohen wasn't a small piece caught by accident. He was a marked target from the very beginning. Cohen's face drained of color so fast it seemed almost theatrical. But there was no acting left in him. His mouth opened slightly, but no words emerged. Just a shallow, rattling breath that barely filled his lungs. He knew. Jasmine could see it. Everyone could see it. He understood, maybe for the first time, that he wasn't simply facing public humiliation or political damage. He was facing the full, crushing weight of a federal machine that had moved against him quietly, methodically, without giving him the slightest chance to defend himself. And Jasmine, calm, sharp, unrelenting, wasn't merely a prosecutor today. She was the messenger of that machine, and her message was devastatingly clear. You are not special. You are not protected. You are prey. The cameras caught every second of it. The tremble at the corner of Cohen's mouth, the way his fingers gripped the edge of the table as if trying to anchor himself against the rising tide. Jasmine allowed the moment to stretch, knowing exactly what she was doing, knowing that some truths didn't need to be shouted. They just needed to be delivered with precision, like a surgeon cutting into rotten flesh. Operation Taxman, she said, her voice low but carrying with absolute authority, is a national task force designed to dismantle large-scale networks of tax evasion, shell companies, and money laundering, especially those connected to high-ranking figures and political elites. She let that sink in, watching Cohen flinch like a man cornered by a predator he had never believed would dare strike him. It was built for people who thought they were too powerful to be touched, she added, her words slicing through the room with deadly precision. People like you. The buzz from the press gallery surged again, reporters scribbling furiously, their faces pale with the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Cohen barely seemed to hear them. His world had shrunk down to a single point. Jasmine Crockett's voice, steady and merciless, driving the final nails into a coffin he had built with his own greed. He knew, even before she said it, that escape was no longer possible. No backroom deals, no political favors, no clever lawyers twisting words into lifelines. Jasmine didn't even have to raise her voice. She simply let the facts do the work, and the facts were merciless. You were one of the first names entered into the sealed ledger, Mr. Cohen, Jasmine continued, her tone sharpened to a razor's edge. You weren't an accident. You weren't a side target. You were the blueprint. Her words were measured, each one heavier than the last, hammering Cohen deeper into the ground. Every shell company you created, every false invoice you filed, every dollar you laundered through offshore accounts. It's all in there, cataloged, cross-referenced, and waiting for the courts to finish what Operation Taxman started. She said it without anger, without triumph, just cold, clean truth. Because in that moment, the truth was the only weapon left, and it was more lethal than anything Cohen had ever imagined. For a few seconds, it seemed Cohen might speak, might beg, might throw out some desperate defense. But then he sagged back in his chair, the fight leaking out of him in a slow, pitiful collapse. The camera zoomed in, catching every second of his unraveling. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't smile. She didn't offer any mercy. She simply sat there, steady and unsparing, letting the silence punish him harder than any words could. Around them, the room crackled with the energy of a nation watching a corrupt empire crumble. Not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding fall into ruin. And still, Jasmine held his gaze. Still, she didn't look away. Because today wasn't about anger or vengeance. It was about justice finally finding its mark. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold still. Cohen sagging in his chair, the cameras devouring his collapse, the audience caught between breath and disbelief. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned in slightly, a movement so small yet so heavy it felt like a closing trap. Her voice came out steady, sharp, impossible to escape. "Who coordinated, Mr. Cohen?" she asked, her words slicing straight through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. "Who protected you while you built these cross-border networks of shell companies and black money?" The question was a hammer blow, impossible to dodge, each syllable nailing Cohen tighter to the floor. He swallowed hard, visibly flinching under the fluorescent lights that now seemed to spotlight every crack in his defenses. His mouth opened, a desperate reflex, but no answers came rushing out. Only the shallow, empty gasps of a man realizing the walls were too thick, the ceiling too low, and the doors long since locked. Jasmine didn't need to raise her voice. Her stillness, her certainty, filled the space between them like a tide rising past Cohen's chin. There was nowhere left to run, and nowhere left to hide. Cohen tried anyway. He shifted in his seat, hands fluttering at invisible notes, his gaze darting between committee members, like a man looking for a friendly face and finding only stone. I was following instructions from business partners," he stammered, the words brittle, collapsing under their own weight as soon as they left his lips. Pressure, expectations. It was the environment, not... His voice trailed off, dying in the heavy air Jasmine had weaponized so expertly. Every excuse he clung to sounded smaller, more pathetic, each syllable more hollow than the last. The journalists leaned forward, smelling the blood in the water, their pens flying across notebooks, cameras zooming in to catch every miserable twitch of Cohen's face. Jasmine didn't flinch. She watched him quietly, like a predator giving its prey one last chance to exhaust itself before the inevitable strike. The silence that followed was merciless, a jury that needed no deliberation. Cohen's shoulders sagged a little more, the fight draining out of him with each useless protest. There was no misunderstanding anymore. The game was over, and he had lost. The silence that followed Cohen's last week protest was total, heavy, suffocating, final. No one moved. No one spoke. The cameras rolled in a quiet frenzy, capturing every raw second as Cohen sat there, hollowed out by the weight of the truth pressing against him from all sides. And still Jasmine Crockett waited, patient and merciless, giving him no lifeline, offering him no space to slip away. It wasn't cruelty, it was justice. She knew, everyone knew, that if he was going to break, it had to be here, under the relentless pressure of the truth he had spent a lifetime outrunning. Cohen blinked slowly, like a man trying to find oxygen in a room with no air left. His fingers trembled against the table, and for a moment it seemed like he might hold the line. But when he finally opened his mouth, the words didn't come out in a shout or a protest. They came out as a slow, broken surrender. "I wasn't alone," Cohen said, the words rasping out of him like they had to be dragged over broken glass. He didn't look at Jasmine. He didn't look at anyone. His gaze dropped to the table, to the mess of papers that document his downfall in merciless detail. There were networks, he muttered, his voice low, raw, almost unrecognizable. Shell companies, offshore accounts. It wasn't just about hiding money. He swallowed hard, the motion painful, his Adam's apple bobbing like a drowning man fighting for breath. It was about moving it, laundering it. He gripped the edge of the table tighter, knuckles whitening, as if he could hold on to something. Anything, to stop the truth from spilling out faster. There were politicians, CEOs investment groups, big names, people who needed their money invisible. His voice cracked at the edges, the reality too massive to frame neatly. And I helped them. I built the bridges they walked across. For 10 years, I kept the system greased so no one would ever get caught. A ripple of pure shock moved through the chamber. Not noise, not motion, but something deeper, a collective realization that what they were hearing was far worse than any had anticipated. Jasmine didn't blink. She let Cohen's words fill the space between them, the air growing thicker, heavier with every syllable he gave up. Cohen shifted miserably in his seat, running a hand across his face like he could somehow wipe away the confession now hanging between them. His entire body seemed to sag under the weight of what he had finally admitted. The years spent as a ghost in the system, making sure the rich and powerful could act without consequence, while the rest of the world lived under a different set of rules. He wasn't a pawn. He wasn't a victim. He had been the architect of a machinery built to launder greed into untouchable wealth. And now, under Jasmine's unblinking gaze, he could no longer hide behind crafted denials and well-paid silences. "You moved billions," Jasmine said, her voice still steady, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "You built tunnels no one could see, not even the regulators, not even the tax courts. You didn't just protect the money, you erased it." Cohen flinched at the bluntness of it, but he didn't deny it. How could he? The facts sat in front of him, a tidal wave made of ink and paper, and numbers that didn't lie. The lights overhead seemed to burn hotter now, or maybe it was just the fire of exposure finally eating through the lies he had wrapped around himself for so long. Cohen let out a breath that sounded almost like a sob, but no one in the room moved to comfort him. No one offered him the dignity of pity. He had traded that away, transaction by transaction, over the long, invisible years when he thought no one would ever see him for what he truly was. Slowly, painfully, Cohen began listing names. He didn't shout them. He didn't dramatize them. He spoke them the way a prisoner counts the links of a chain around his own neck. Methodical, resigned, exhausted. Company executives, political donors, international banking officers. Jasmine scribbled nothing down. She had already prepared for this. She knew what he would say, even if no one else in the room had truly been ready to hear it. And yet hearing it spill from Cohen's own broken voice made the crimes real in a way no report or expose ever could. These were not just vague acts of corruption. These were networks with faces, families, election campaigns, and luxury addresses, all stitched together by greed and the false promise that the law would never touch them. The room remained silent, save for Cohen's strained breathing and the quiet clicks of cameras immortalizing his downfall. Jasmine allowed him to finish without interruption. There was no need to rush the death spiral of a lie finally giving way to truth. When Cohen finally stopped talking, the silence returned. Not as a pause this time, but as a verdict. He sagged back into his chair, his hands useless and limp against the tabletop. A man undone by his own survival instincts turned against him. Jasmine remained steady across from him, her hands folded neatly, her face unreadable. The embodiment of the justice he had thought he could outrun. And for the first time in the entire hearing, Michael Cohen looked small. Not just guilty, not just defeated. Small, a man who had spent a decade building bridges for kings, only to drown under the weight of their secrets. The silence after Cohen's confession wasn't empty. It was thick, heavy, almost alive, pressing down on everyone in the room. It would have been easy for Jasmine to end it there, to let Cohen drown in his own admissions, to let the cameras record the slow, pitiful collapse of a man who thought himself untouchable. But Jasmine Crockett had not come here just for truth. She had come for accountability. And so, with the same calm precision she had wielded all morning, she leaned forward slightly, her presence cutting across the table like the edge of a blade drawn from its sheath. Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. In its steadiness, in its terrible certainty, it carried more force than a gavel slamming down from the bench. "You didn't just betray the law, Mr. Cohen," Jasmine said, her tone sharp enough to leave a scar. "You sold out democracy itself for greed." The words sliced through the chamber, and the ripple they sent through the crowd was almost physical. A jolt, a collective intake of breath, as if something sacred had just been named and laid bare. Cohen visibly recoiled, his body shrinking even further into his chair, but Jasmine pressed forward, giving him no shelter from the storm she unleashed. "Every time you shifted a dollar, every shell company you built, every signature you forged, you weren't just stealing money," she continued, each word deliberate, each phrase like a nail hammered into the coffin of his illusions. "You were dismantling the very idea that the law could be trusted, that power had limits, that truth mattered." Her words moved through the room like wildfire, igniting silent outrage in every corner. Senators stiffening in their seats, journalists scribbling with renewed ferocity, even the guards at the back of the room standing a little straighter. Jasmine's eyes never left Cohen's face, and Cohen, once the master of deals and whispered threats, now looked like nothing more than a frightened man caught in the final collapse of his own empire. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The weight of the truth she spoke crashed against him harder than any shouted accusation could have. "You betrayed the millions who believed that justice applied equally," Jasmine said, her voice tightening just slightly. The only betrayal of the fire burning beneath her control. "You showed the world that for the right price, the law was just another asset to be bought and sold." Cohen lowered his eyes, unable or unwilling to meet the storm he had unleashed. The papers on the table between them, the evidence, the names, the figures, seemed to burn under the harsh light of reality, no longer just numbers and transactions, but the wreckage of trust itself. Jasmine allowed the silence to stretch, allowed him to sit with what he had done, the enormity of it settling onto his hunched shoulders like chains. She knew that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the system he had served, the corruption he had fueled, and the truth that needed to be spoken aloud for the sake of every citizen who believed the law should mean something more than power. The cameras continued to record every agonizing second, capturing the raw collapse of a man stripped of every pretense. Cohen's breathing grew shallow, his hands twitching slightly against the wood of the table, as if searching for something, anything to hold on to. But there was nothing left. Jasmine had made sure of that. She straightened slightly, her presence expanding, until it seemed to fill every corner of the chamber. "Your greed wasn't private," she said, her words cutting so cleanly that Cohen flinched. "It infected the system. It weakened the walls meant to protect ordinary people from the ambitions of the powerful." Her voice didn't crack. It didn't waver. It carried the cold, relentless clarity of a knife pushed slowly but inexorably deeper into flesh. "And you did it with your eyes wide open, Mr. Cohen. You didn't stumble into corruption. You built a career on it." The weight of her words settled like a second atmosphere over the hearing room, heavy and unrelenting. Cohen seemed to shrink even further into himself, his shoulders curling inward, his hands now clasped tightly in his lap, like a man awaiting judgment he already knew he couldn't escape. The journalists had gone nearly silent, their pens frozen mid-sentence, their cameras capturing the stillness of a man unmade by the truth. Jasmine allowed the silence to stretch again, knowing the power of it, knowing that sometimes the absence of sound could speak louder than any shouting match. She let the image of him, small, defeated, exposed, imprint itself on every mind watching, a living testimony to what unchecked greed looked like when stripped of its golden armor. Finally, Jasmine leaned back slightly, her gaze never wavering, her voice steady and cold. "This isn't just your shame," she said, her words falling into the charged air like heavy stones. "It's the stain you helped spread across every institution you touched, across every law you twisted, across every citizen you betrayed." There was no anger in her voice, only an implacable finality, the kind that offered no escape, no forgiveness, no revision of the record. In that moment, Cohen wasn't just a disgraced lawyer or a fallen fixer. He was the embodiment of a deeper rot, dragged out into the light by a woman who had refused to look away. And no matter how many millions he had moved, no matter how many politicians he had protected, or how many loopholes he had exploited, here in this room, under this weight, he was finally irrevocably small. The final words hung in the air long after Jasmine finished speaking, a silence heavier than any verdict. The world had watched Michael Cohen shrink, watched the full weight of his betrayal laid bare under the cold, merciless precision of Jasmine Crockett's cross-examination. But the reckoning wasn't contained within the four walls of the chamber. It was already leaking out. Through the cameras, through the whispered texts of aides, through the breaking news banners erupting across every major network. Like a fault line snapping under years of pressure, America trembled, and then it erupted. By the time the hearing adjourned, the rotunda outside the Capitol was already a frenzy. Journalists barked questions into roaring microphones, desperate to capture reactions in real time. Protesters filled the steps and sidewalks, their handmade signs punching the sky with angry colors. No one above the law. Corruption is treason. Jasmine spoke for us. Cable news anchors, breathless and blinking against the chaos, stumbled through live coverage as the crowd outside grew into a living, breathing force of fury and disbelief. Every major network, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, abandoned scheduled programming to stream footage from the hearing on endless loop. Jasmine's voice, cool and lethal, played over and over. You didn't just betray the law, you sold out democracy itself for greed. It wasn't a statement anymore. It was a spark thrown into a field of dry anger waiting for ignition. Social media detonated. Within minutes, Jasmine Crockett's name was trending globally, eclipsing entertainment, sports, even international news. Clips of her confrontation with Cohen were cut, shared, and reposted millions of times. Memes flooded the internet. Images of Jasmine wielding a gavel like a sword, captions that simply read, "Justice served cold." Commentators across the spectrum, from progressive pundits to traditionally cautious centrists, hailed her performance as a watershed moment. For the first time in years, one anchor said on live TV, his voice cracking with emotion, we watched someone drag the rot into the light and refuse to blink. In coffee shops, office break rooms, living rooms across America, ordinary citizens leaned closer to their screens, feeling a pulse they had not felt in a long time. The pulse of accountability fighting its way back into public life. Yet beneath the explosion of righteous anger, there was another current, a deeper, darker rumble of reckoning. High-rise law firms scrambled to review their client lists, government agencies prepared internal statements, and financial institutions quietly convened emergency meetings. Everyone who had profited from the old system, who had thrived in the shadow world Cohen had helped build, felt the earth shift beneath their feet. They had seen the look in Jasmine Crockett's eyes. Not of vengeance, but of a truth so cold and relentless it would not be bargained with. And they understood. This wasn't just about one man's fall. It was about a wall of protection built over decades, now showing cracks too large to ignore. Inside political war rooms across Washington, strategists huddled around flickering screens, parsing every word Jasmine had spoken, calculating how much of the old guard could be saved and how much would have to burn. Allies of the exposed panicked quietly behind closed doors, issuing statements that condemned Cohen while desperately distancing themselves from the networks he had implicated. But no amount of spin could contain the force Jasmine had unleashed. It wasn't just Michael Cohen on trial anymore. It was an entire era. Back on the Capitol steps, as the sun set behind the marble columns, the crowd kept growing. Someone had brought a portable speaker, and Jasmine's words crackled over the noise, each syllable punching the evening air. You didn't stumble into corruption. You built a career on it. Cheers erupted from the protesters. Strangers hugged each other, tears streaming down faces weathered by too many years of watching justice slip through their fingers. A woman in her 70s, clutching an American flag to her chest, whispered to a reporter, "This is what truth sounds like. I thought I'd never hear it again." Inside her office, away from the chaos she had ignited, Jasmine Crockett sat alone for a moment, staring out at the night. Her hands were still, her breathing steady, but the room around her seemed to hum with the aftershock of what she had done. She knew this wasn't the end. One hearing wouldn't fix a system that had been allowed to rot from the inside for so long. But it was a crack, and cracks, if hit hard enough, became breaks. She had aimed for the fault line, and she had struck true. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't raged. She had simply refused to be silent. And America, battered and cynical as it had become, had listened. The night deepened outside, but the streets stayed alive. A river of voices refusing to go home, refusing to let the moment pass without seizing it. Jasmine watched the distant lights flicker and move, not as chaos, but as proof that somewhere underneath the anger, underneath the outrage, the old bones of democracy were stirring again. Broken, battered, but not dead. Not yet. And for the first time in a long time, Jasmine allowed herself a small, quiet smile. Not a smile of triumph, a smile of beginning. The fire Jasmine Crockett had ignited refused to die with the setting sun. Across the country, the hearing played on endless repeat. In airports, in diners, on giant digital screens in Times Square, flickering like a warning shot against the night sky. But it wasn't just the fall of Michael Cohen that held the nation captive. It was the woman behind the fall. Jasmine Crockett, sharp, fearless, relentless, had stepped into a system many believed too corrupted to touch and ripped the mask off its hidden machinery. And America, cynical and battered though it was, recognized the truth when it heard it spoken without apology. News anchors called her a force of nature. Editorials compared her to icons of past political reckonings. Politicians scrambled to issue statements of support, desperate to ride the tidal wave she had unleashed. But it wasn't just admiration. It was something deeper, something older. The fragile, rising hope that maybe, just maybe, the machinery of democracy still had a pulse left. The name Operation Taxman became a rallying cry overnight. But it wasn't the operation itself that seized the imagination of a restless public. It was what Jasmine had done with it. She hadn't just exposed the hidden players, the billionaires, the corporate raiders, the silent donors who bought their way into impunity. She had shown the country, line by brutal line, how the walls around justice had been quietly hollowed out and sold to the highest bidder. In coffee shops and town halls, in late-night debates across social media, Americans began to ask the questions they had once been too tired or too afraid to voice. Who else? How deep? How long had the rot gone unnoticed? Or worse, unchallenged? And everywhere, woven into the heart of those conversations, was the name Jasmine Crockett. No longer just a congresswoman, but a symbol of the fight that had been dormant too long. It wasn't just talk. Action followed, swift and chaotic. Financial oversight bills that had languished for years were dragged back into debate, dusted off under a new, glaring spotlight. Investigative journalists uncovered networks of lobbyists and offshore accounts tied to names that had once seemed untouchable. Protests formed not just outside courthouses, but outside the homes of corporate executives, demanding accountability beyond courtroom settlements. The message was clear and simple. The era of silent complicity was over. And at the center of it all, echoing louder than any headline, was a single line Jasmine had delivered offhandedly in the aftermath of the hearing. A line that had captured the spirit of the moment like a match to dry tinder. When greed becomes law, rebellion becomes duty. The phrase swept across the country like a battle flag. It appeared on banners at rallies, painted across overpasses, printed on T-shirts and bumper stickers. Protesters shouted it through bullhorns in city streets. College students chalked it onto sidewalks in front of administration buildings, and retired veterans stitched it onto flags they carried into state capitals. The words had weight because they spoke a truth too long, whispered but never declared so plainly. Greed had become law, and now finally rebellion had become duty. Jasmine hadn't just uncovered corruption, she had reawakened something fundamental. The belief that fighting for fairness wasn't naive, wasn't futile, wasn't dead. It was necessary. The backlash was swift and brutal, of course. Power rarely surrendered without a fight. Conservative media called Jasmine reckless, dangerous, an agent of chaos. Wealthy donors whispered threats behind closed doors, warning of political consequences for anyone who stood with her. Anonymous smear campaigns spread online, attacking her credibility, her past, even her family. But it was too late. The narrative had shifted beyond their control. Jasmine had not built her movement on polished slogans or manufactured outrage. She had built it on evidence, cold, undeniable, and public. Every attack against her only confirmed what millions had already seen, that she had struck a nerve no one else had dared touch. Inside the marble walls of Congress, where compromise had too often meant concession, the atmosphere changed in ways subtle but profound. Allies began to speak louder. Rivals hesitated before dismissing her. Committee chairs who had once seen her as a firebrand now saw her as a force they could not afford to ignore. The old rules, rules that had protected the rich and silenced the persistent, trembled under the new scrutiny Jasmine had unleashed. And even as the political machine churned and plotted its resistance, the people outside kept marching, kept chanting, kept demanding. When greed becomes law, rebellion becomes duty. Through it all, Jasmine remained steady, refusing to be baited into spectacle or hollow victory laps. She gave no grand speeches. She granted few interviews. She let the work and the movement speak louder than any press conference ever could. In private, she knew the battle was far from over. Exposing a network was one thing. Breaking it would be another. But for the first time in a long time, she also knew she wasn't fighting alone. Across cities and fields, across generational and political divides, a current had been sparked. Not blind outrage, not partisan fury, a slow, stubborn, rising refusal to let corruption wear the mask of normalcy ever again. And somewhere deep inside the rising storm she had called into being, Jasmine Crockett stood exactly where she had always intended to be. At the fault line where silence had shattered, speaking the words no one could unhear. Victory smelled different than Jasmine Crockett had ever imagined. It wasn't sweet. It wasn't triumphant. It was thick, metallic, heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm when you know the lightning is coming, but you can't see it yet. Sitting alone in her office hours after the hearing ended, she could still hear the distant echo of her own voice playing on TV screens across America. She could feel the rumble of protest rolling down city streets. She could see her name flashing like a lit match across social media feeds. Jasmine Crockett, the woman who stood alone and cracked the spine of corruption wide open. But in the heavy silence of the room, stripped of applause and headlines, she felt only the weight, a slow, grinding awareness that what she had started was bigger, messier, and far more dangerous than anything the cameras could capture. She shifted in her chair, the old leather creaking beneath her, and stared out the tall windows where the city lights blurred into the humid night. Somewhere down there, thousands were chanting her name, hoisting signs, demanding change. And yet here, in this quiet high above it all, Jasmine felt the battlefield stretching wider than any protest line could reach. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was only the blood-soaked beginning. The folder still sat open on her desk, the documents she had unveiled to the world now inert under a sterile desk lamp. Names, companies, accounts, blood trails disguised as spreadsheets. Jasmine dragged her fingers lightly over the top page, not to read it. She had memorized every line long before the hearing, but simply to remind herself that it was real, that she hadn't dreamed it, that she hadn't imagined the sick rot she had unearthed. Each name on those papers had lived, breathed, smiled on magazine covers, delivered keynotes at galas, toasted champagne behind closed doors, while building an empire on stolen money and stolen futures. And for too long, the world had bowed before them without ever daring to lift the curtain. Now the curtain was gone, ripped away by the hands of a woman they had never seen coming. The phone on her desk vibrated again, another endless call she wouldn't answer. Aides, reporters, allies, strangers. They all wanted a piece of the moment. They wanted sound bites. They wanted celebration. They wanted Jasmine to smile for the cameras, to bask in the triumph. But Jasmine didn't feel triumphant. She felt the sharp edge of reality cutting deeper into her gut with every passing minute. Exposing corruption was not the same as defeating it. Snakes didn't die when you dragged them into the light. They coiled tighter. They struck faster. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly through her nose, feeling the tension coil between her shoulder blades like a wire pulled too tight. Victory wasn't the end of fear. It was the start of new enemies. Enemies who had watched her from behind two-way mirrors. Enemies whose names weren't on any public record yet, but who now knew hers all too well. Jasmine's mind flickered back to the hearing, the way Michael Cohen had crumbled. Not like a man facing justice, but like a piece of a greater machine finally stripped of its cover. He hadn't fallen alone. She had seen the tremors ripple outward, the sudden phone calls from lobbyists, the canceled meetings, the tightened smiles in Capitol hallways. The system was bigger than Cohen, bigger than any one man. And now that she had cracked the surface, the whole trembling structure would either collapse or come crashing down on her head. The lamp buzzed slightly overhead, casting harsh shadows across the papers. For a fleeting second, she caught her own reflection in the dark window. A woman sitting still, hands folded, gaze hard and unflinching. But beneath the armor, she could feel it, the exhaustion clawing at her muscles, the quiet grief for a world that had allowed monsters to thrive so easily. For every Cohen dragged into daylight, there were 10 more waiting, their smiles sharper, their knives cleaner, their tracks covered better. Still, Jasmine knew she would not, could not turn away now. She stood slowly, the floor cold against her heels, and walked toward the window. Down below, the city vibrated with life, neon signs flashing, sirens wailing somewhere distant, protest chants carrying on the breeze like ancient battle cries. It looked alive. It sounded alive. But Jasmine knew better. Power hid in boardrooms and vaults and private jets, not on street corners. And power, when threatened, didn't debate. It retaliated. Her fingers touched the glass lightly, feeling the cool hum of it against her skin. Somewhere out there, she knew, they were already meeting. The hidden players who had once slept easy, now scrambling to decide what to do with the woman who had dared name them out loud. She pictured the smoky rooms, the whispered threats, the sharpened knives aimed not at her body, but at her credibility, her family, her future. And still, the thought didn't make her flinch. Because Jasmine Crockett had not come this far to bow. She had come to burn. Her mind whispered back her own words, the ones that now flooded the streets and the screens, and the hearts of those who had waited too long for someone to speak without fear. When greed becomes law, rebellion becomes duty. The phrase wasn't just a rallying cry for the nation anymore. It was a shield she would carry into every battle still to come. It was the answer to every smear that would be hurled at her, every trap set in committee hearings, every threat scrawled in anonymous letters. It was the reminder that she did not stand alone. Behind her now stood millions, tired, angry, hopeful, ready. She pulled her jacket from the back of her chair, the fabric still carrying the faint, sweaty echo of the day's battle. She slipped it on with slow, deliberate movements, as if donning armor. Outside, the streets roared louder. Not a mob, not a riot, but a living testament that truth, once spoken clearly enough, could move mountains. Jasmine turned from the window. She clicked off the lamp, plunging the office into a cool, silver twilight lit only by the city's restless glow. She didn't need more light to see the path ahead. She knew it now. Jagged, dangerous, necessary. She walked toward the door, each step steady, deliberate, unshaken. The storm she had unleashed was only just beginning, and Jasmine Crockett, battle-scarred and unbreakable, walked straight into it. The victory Jasmine Crockett had carved out wasn't a shield. It was a target. She knew it the moment she stepped out of the hearing room and felt the air shift. The cheers outside were real, the gratitude raw and powerful. But somewhere behind the noise, the old machine had begun to move again, quietly, purposefully, dangerously. They had underestimated her once. They wouldn't make the same mistake twice. The first signs were almost invisible. Calls from longtime allies that suddenly went unanswered. Meetings delayed, then canceled without reason. Invitations to panels and fundraisers. once so frequent they blurred together, drying up overnight. Jasmine wasn't surprised. Power didn't attack in the open. It poisoned the air first, making it harder to breathe, harder to trust. In private rooms and silent exchanges, those threatened by what she had exposed began weaving their counterstrike. She wasn't facing just Cohen anymore. She was facing the entire ecosystem that had allowed him to thrive. The first blow landed in the media, a leak crafted with surgical malice, accusing Jasmine of conflicts of interest in cases she had touched years before. The allegations were thin, laughable even, but the point wasn't guilt. The point was to seed doubt, to shift the narrative from what she had uncovered to who she was. Jasmine watched it unfold on the news with an unflinching gaze, the edges of her resolve sharpening. This wasn't justice turning against her. This was fear, weaponized by the powerful, flailing to protect itself. Inside Congress, the walls began closing subtly around her. Colleagues who had praised her privately now avoided her publicly. Committee chairs whispered about the risk of distractions. Lobbyists tightened their networks, cutting her out of crucial negotiations. She could almost hear the machinery working. Old alliances rewiring themselves, money changing hands, favors being called in. Jasmine understood it instinctively. This was a siege, not a sudden strike, but a slow strangulation designed to bleed her influence away 1 inch at a time. And yet the more they pressed, the stronger she stood. She didn't lash out. She didn't play the victim. Instead, she turned methodical, building a new operation from scratch. Smaller, leaner, but unbreakable. She surrounded herself with aides who had seen real battles, not career politicians, but fighters who knew how to outlast storms. She tripled down on transparency, publishing every donation, every expenditure, every meeting, daring anyone to find a crack in her armor. She met every smear, not with outrage, but with overwhelming facts, flooding the field so thick with proof that lies drowned before they could take root. Outside the Capitol, the fire she had started burned hotter than ever. Town halls overflowed. Grassroots donations poured in. Her single phrase, "When greed becomes law, rebellion becomes duty," became more than a rallying cry. It became a movement. Across the country, local candidates began running on platforms of anti-corruption and financial reform. College students organized marches. Retired veterans waved handmade banners. Ordinary citizens, long ignored and forgotten, found their voices again. Jasmine had cracked the foundation, and through those cracks, the people had flooded in. But Jasmine never forgot. The old system was wounded, not dead. It would regroup. It would evolve. It would strike harder next time. Every step forward she took would be met with 10 more traps laid in her path. They would come for her funding. They would come for her reputation. They would come for her very sense of belonging in the halls of power she had dared to challenge. She understood this not with fear, but with the cold clarity of a soldier who knows the war is far from over. Late at night, when the world outside quieted and only the low hum of the city filled the air, Jasmine stood by her office window and let herself feel the full weight of what was coming. The loneliness, the danger, the endless grind of fighting not just enemies, but a system built to outlast any single challenger. But she also felt something else, something deeper and more immovable than fear. Conviction, the kind that couldn't be shaken by scandal or muted by backroom deals. The kind that didn't need polls or praise to survive. She whispered the words again, the ones that had carried her through every ambush, every betrayal, every sleepless night. When greed becomes law, rebellion becomes duty. And with that, Jasmine Crockett turned back to her desk, to the next battle plan, to the next war waiting just beyond the horizon. Because the machine wasn't done, but neither was she. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.